Welcome after this break in the second day of our seminar under the session Contemporary Reflections on Dialogue and Freedom. The next speaker will make his intervention in Spanish, so I'll change to Spanish now. Bueno, pues bienvenidos después de la pausa. Ahora va a hablar el profesor José Antonio Antón Pacheco de la Universidad de Sevilla con el tema Sincretismo y ecumenismo, el maniqueísmo como ejemplo. El profesor Pacheco es profesor de Historia de la Filosofía en la Universidad de Sevilla. Se ha dedicado al estudio de religiones comparadas, de la hermenéutica, del simbolismo y del pensamiento tradicional en general. Ha prestado un especial interés a la figura de Emanuel Swedenborg, sobre el que ha publicado varios ensayos. En los últimos tiempos, su investigación se centra sobre el mundo iranio. Es cofundador de la Sociedad Española de Iranología, el gnosticismo y otras corrientes filosóficas de la antigüedad tardía. También es cofundador u coordinador del Centro de Estudios Espirituales Comparados, que organiza todos los años reuniones en arenas de San Pedro. Parte de su obra está recogida en el libro El ser y los símbolos publicados en Madrid del 2010. Bueno, pues queda obvio que esto es una capacidad tremenda española que ahora vamos a escuchar y sin más, don José, le doy la palabra.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a los organizadores de este estupendo seminario de las Tres Culturas, especialmente a Antonio de Diego y a Juanjo Padial. Y bueno, voy a empezar ya directamente con el tema que nos trae. Y es precisamente algo que yo creo que está un poco en la base de muchas de las reflexiones que siempre han girado alrededor de este seminario, sobre el que además me siento muy próximo, ¿no? Ya colaboré con él hace mucho tiempo, ¿no? Lo llevaba Jacinto Choza. Y es el tema del universalismo, del ecumenismo en el ámbito religioso. Y voy a poner un ejemplo que me parece muy paradigmático, como es el del maniqueísmo. Bien, siempre que se habla, o por lo menos generalmente alrededor del tema del ecumenismo religioso, del universalismo religioso, del liberalismo en relación con las religiones, pues es muy habitual que surja la crítica o el tachar esa actitud de sincretismo, ¿no? El término sincretismo, pues yo creo que a nadie se nos oculta que tiene un cierto matiz negativo o francamente negativo, sobre todo cuando se baraja en el ámbito de los estudios de las religiones. Cuando decir que alguien es sincrético, pues significa más o menos que lo que ha llevado a cabo es una composición más o menos artificial de piezas, de elementos de diferente procedencia y ha construido pues un objeto artificial en el fondo, es decir, que no obedece a algo que sería genuino. Hay un autor sobre el que esta acusación continuamente ha girado en torno a él, me estoy refiriendo a René Guénon, como ejemplo muy claro también. De hecho, yo cuando se me invitó, en un principio pensé hacerlo sobre René Guénon. Luego, por diferentes motivos, he preferido el maniqueísmo. Pero fijaos, a pesar de las protestas Es decir, a pesar de que el propio René Guénon siempre se mostró como muy reacio, siempre negó su condición de sincretista, sin embargo, es una especie de San Benito, especie de leyenda negra que siempre ha acompañado la figura de René Guénon. Y esto es porque esta formulación negativa, esta acusación negativa de sincretismo, yo creo que en el fondo obedece a que siempre se analiza este fenómeno desde una perspectiva muy limitada, si queréis incluso a veces muy localista, muy aldeanista, mientras que los así llamados sincréticos pues lo analizan desde una perspectiva más universal, más universalista, que era precisamente la de René Guénon. Bien, entonces la intención que yo quiero proyectar aquí, que yo quiero manifestar, es que sincretismo no es un derivado casi automático de una posición universalista o ecumenista, y que por supuesto estas posiciones acusadas de sincretismo no obedecen a una construcción artificial a base de piezas aisladas para formar algo que sería, pues, eso, una especie de monstruo de Frankenstein religioso. Sino que por el contrario, esas posiciones universalistas obedecen a motivaciones profundas, motivaciones orgánicas, a motivaciones, en definitiva, experimentadas vitalmente. Para abordar el tema del maniqueísmo, que yo creo que, y eso fue uno de los motivos por los cuales lo elegí, por un lado, responde totalmente y perfectamente a la noción de ecumenismo o universalismo, y también responde tradicionalmente a la acusación de sincretismo. Hay que tener en cuenta que el propio maniqueísmo surge ya en un contexto universalista, es decir, ese ámbito formado por la koiné de la antigüedad tardía, por la ecumene, es decir, la situación formada a partir del siglo I, le podríamos buscar la base o el origen en la conquista de Alejandro Magno, y respondería a la cierta unidad política, social, cultural, que se forma a partir de la conquista y, por lo tanto, de una cierta unificación del mundo llevada a cabo por Alejandro Magno. No obstante, hay que decir, y esto también me parece importante, que, y aquí ya pues Jonas y Burker han insistido mucho, que realmente entre el mundo griego y el mundo indio, es decir, en ese espacio que iría desde Grecia hasta el Valle del Indo, ahí realmente siempre ha habido una koiné. Ya Burker habla de la koiné del bronce. Jonas habla de la koiné generada y producida por el imperio aqueménida en el siglo V a.C. Es decir, que realmente es cierto que Alejandro Magno, luego la unificación del mundo concluida por el Imperio Romano, es verdad que eso ha propiciado un cierto cinecismo, una cohabitación, pero de hecho había ya un terreno propicio a que se consolidara y a que se consumara esa koiné. Pues bien, efectivamente, como sabemos, Mani nace en el siglo III, por lo tanto, tercero después de Cristo, evidentemente, por lo tanto, nace de lleno dentro del ámbito temporal que denominamos la koiné o la ecumene. pero no es el único caso, no es el único ejemplo que podemos nosotros poner de espíritu ecumenista. El propio Zenón, ¿no? El estoico, el estoicismo, Filón de Alejandría, por supuesto, la figura de Numenio, Numenio de Apamea, ¿no? que decía que igualaba a Moisés a Platón, por ejemplo. Pablo de Tarso. Yo os propongo un ejercicio que se lo propongo siempre a mis alumnos, y es que lean el discurso de Hechos de los Apóstoles de 17-22, si mal no recuerdo, es decir, el discurso de Pablo en el Areópago, lo lean como si lo hubiera escrito Filón de Alejandría. Perfectamente responde a los mismos planteamientos universalistas de Filón de Alejandría, puestos en boca ahora de Pablo de Tarso. Es decir, Pablo de Tarso efectivamente es otro de los grandes promotores de ese universalismo. Decía Harnack que el judaísmo de la antigüedad se libró del etnocentrismo gracias, por un lado, a Filón de Alejandría, a través de la filosofía, y de Pablo de Tarso a través del cristianismo. Bien, en cualquier caso, efectivamente, vemos cómo hay un terreno propicio a posiciones ecumenistas y universalistas ya en el humus cultural que rodea el propio nacimiento de Mani. Hay más motivos. Yo creo que, por ejemplo, la constitución de los grandes imperios en este momento, el imperio romano, por supuesto, el imperio sasánida, que son auténticas unificaciones del mundo, ayudaron indudablemente a constituir, a consolidar este ámbito, este ambiente de cohabitación que da como consecuencia la koiné. Esto es una idea que ya que Karl Jasper había barajado en su teoría sobre el tiempo axial, cuando él se plantea por qué precisamente en el siglo VIII, VII antes de Cristo hay esta emergencia, esta auténtica aurora del pensar, pues él la relacionaba con la constitución de los grandes imperios. Es algo que también sucede en la antigüedad tardía y que por lo tanto creo que es un tema, que es un factor a tener en cuenta. Por otro lado, y buscando pues, argumentos que nos expliquen y que nos justifiquen la actitud de Mani, como digo, en este sentido resulta muy paradigmática. Tenemos que hacer también referencia a que la propia formación religiosa judía de Mani, porque hablemos ahora, una de las raíces, uno de los trasfondos de Mani, en principio es cristiano, él forma parte de una corriente llamada el casaíta, pero a su vez los elcasaítas son judeocristianos, es decir, forma parte de esa rama del cristianismo que no se desliga de la sinagoga. Pues bien, en la medida en que el propio Mani está muy vinculado con el judaísmo, un judaísmo, no el judaísmo sadoquita, no el judaísmo del templo, no el judaísmo ortodoxo, digamos así, sino un judaísmo más esotérico, muy ligado a todo lo que es el ciclo de Enoch. Muy bien, en esa medida, en la pertenencia de Mani al judaísmo, debemos de recordar que también tradicionalmente hay una corriente universalista en la Torá que recorre toda la Torá, cuál es el pensamiento sapiencial. El pensamiento sapiencial, es decir, la sapiencial que tiene la Jomá, la sabiduría, como eje referencial frente a otras posiciones más nacionalista, más exclusivista, fomenta un pensamiento pues, universalista. Dentro también de las corrientes judeocristianas y enraizadas en el propio en este otro judaísmo no, digamos, no ortodoxo, porque aunque no es una palabra que me guste, lo de ortodoxo y heterodoxo, ¿no? Pero en fin, para entendernos. Está también la teología del verus profeta, teología del verus profeta o del profeta de la verdad o del profeta verdadero, que en el caso del cristianismo la vemos recogida en las pseudoclementinas, un corpus literario judio-cristiano de una extraordinaria importancia en la antigüedad tardía. Bien, ¿qué es, en resumidas, breve, por decirlo rápidamente, qué es la teología del verus profeta? La teología del verus profeta es la idea de que Dios ha suscitado a lo largo de la historia diferentes profetas que se encargan de mantener viva la revelación de Dios. De tal manera que no ha habido ningún momento en el cual la humanidad ha estado, en el caso de la teología del verus profeta, el cristianismo, perdón, el judaísmo, ha estado ajeno a la presencia de la palabra de Dios. Adán, Set, Sem, Abraham, David, Jesucristo, San Pablo, todo eso son muestras de eslabones de la tradición del verus profeta. Por lo tanto, hay un recorrido, ¿no?, que se inserta a lo largo de la historia que claro está, luego va a emerger en la figura de Mani. Pero la figura de Mani va a ser en este sentido enormemente amplia y con un horizonte mucho más extenso. ¿Por qué? Pues porque Mani va a introducir entre esos profetas suscitados por Dios que forman la teología del verbo profeta, esa cadena iniciática, ¿no? Esa isnat, ¿no?, podemos decir. ¿A quién introduce? A Zaratustra. A Zaratustra, y aquí vamos a tener ahora la aportación, junto a la aportación judeocristiana, la gran aportación zoroastriana. Realmente, ya de alguna manera, también en este sentido, le tenía preparado el terreno Mani, porque en una determinada línea de la primera patrística, Clemente de Alejandría, Orígenes, Justino Mártir, fijaos, siempre gente muy ligada a Alejandría, el gran foco cultural de la antigüedad tardía, pues había habido este planteamiento con respecto a los griegos en referencia al cristianismo. Es decir, al principio de la primera reflexión teológica cristiana hay un debate que es: ¿tenemos que aceptar o no a los filósofos paganos? Entonces aquí, claro, están todas las posiciones, las más extremistas, no hay que rechazarlo absolutamente, y luego está Staciano, por ejemplo, Tertuliano, y luego está la de Clemente, la de Justino, la de Lascancio, la de Arnovio, aunque estos son latinos, que en resumidas cuentas dice lo siguiente: Platón, Homero, Aristóteles, es decir, los sabios griegos, Sócrates, también forman parte de la revelación. Es decir, eso es lo que algún que otro autor ha llamado el tercer evangelio. El tercer evangelio sería la filosofía griega. Por tanto, eso da lugar a una incorporación y una aceptación dentro del cristianismo de la filosofía griega. Aquí juega una gran importancia la figura de Hermes Trismegisto, pero bueno, no podemos detenernos en la figura de Hermes porque sería demasiado. Pero en cualquier caso, lo interesante ahora es comprobar cómo hay otra corriente, y fijaos el pluralismo tan enorme que hay dentro del cristianismo originario. Hay una corriente que, digamos, incorpora y acepta todo lo que es la sabiduría anterior a el cristianismo, sabiduría griega, la pagana, por lo tanto, como susceptible de ser incorporada al propio cristianismo, de tal manera que, pues de alguna manera podríamos decir, Platón, Hermes, Pitágoras, pues también forman parte de la teología del verbum profeta. Fijaos que esto yo estoy diciendo aquí así tan apresuradamente, esto tiene su continuidad a lo largo de la Edad Media, porque esto es una idea que está muy presente en toda la escuela de Chartres. Esto está presente de una forma determinante en el Renacimiento, en Mastificino, Pico de la Mirándola, Lorenzo Valla, en todos estos autores. Por lo tanto, estos son temas que no son flor de un día, sino que han tenido una presencia a veces subterránea o a veces, diríamos, no muy patente, pero desde luego de una manera efectiva. Bien, volvamos de nuevo entonces a el maniqueísmo. Ya estamos diciendo y todo que hay un terreno propicio para que la figura de Mani pues emerja y se erija como un factor aglutinador de síntesis de diferentes posiciones religiosas. Él, en un principio es cristiano o es judeocristiano. Si es verdad que él pertenecía a la corriente de los elcasitas, cosa que parece cierto, ¿no? Algunos piensan que tal vez fuera mandeo, pero bueno, no me parece. Yo creo que efectivamente él procedía de un medio elcasita. Por lo tanto, en este sentido, judío y cristiano, judeocristiano, estrictamente hablando, judeocristiano. Ciertamente, un judaísmo y un cristianismo, para empezar, el judaísmo visionario, esotérico, dentro de lo que habitualmente se llama literatura apócrifa, y el cristianismo, un cristianismo siríaco. La lengua materna de Mani es el parleví-parto, pero la lengua cultural, digamos, la lengua escrita, con lo que escribe Mani, es en siríaco, que es digamos, la lengua franca de ese momento. El cristianismo del que bebe Mani es un cristianismo siríaco, por tanto oriental, y muy deudor del Evangelio de Tomás, del Evangelio de Tomás, de uno de los llamados evangelios apócrifos, por ejemplo, de la apocalíptica, las apocalipsis de todo un gran número de apocalipsis, también de los denominados apócrifos. Pues ese es el cristianismo del que bebe Mani. Junto a esta gran aportación del cristianismo, un cristianismo que ya lleva, vuelvo a repetir, consigo, lleva ínsito el propio judaísmo, está la otra gran formación que va a componer lo que es el núcleo originario de la doctrina maniquea, y que es el zoroastrismo. Claro, no es algo extraño, no es algo ajeno, dado que el propio Mani es iranio, es parto. De hecho, incluso parece ser que está emparentado con los arsácidas, que es la dinastía parta que ya va a concluir, ¿no? Es decir, él conoce al último rey parto y inmediatamente después viene la dinastía sasánida, que son persas. Pero bueno, son iranios. Y el parto y el paleví parto y el paleví persa, que es la lengua que se hablaba entonces en Persia, pues son muy parecidos, ¿no? Bien, por lo tanto, no es extraño en absoluto el que haya una incorporación del zoroastrismo al núcleo originario de la predicación maniquea, de Mani. Y por supuesto, digamos, una de las formas de justificación o de explicación es que la figura de Zaratustra pues se incorpora a esa teología del Venus profeta, a esa cadena de testigos de Dios, y Zaratustra sería para los persas lo que fue Hermes para los griegos, Hermes para los egipcios, Platón para los griegos, Moisés, Abraham, bueno, perdón, Moisés no, he dicho Moisés muy rápidamente, pero Moisés no, Abraham sí, y es muy significativo que Moisés no aparezca en la teología del Venus profeta. Claro, Moisés es se supone, el autor de la Torá como normatividad, es el judaísmo normativo, es el judaísmo alágico, pero ese no es el judaísmo al cual nos estábamos refiriendo. Ese no es el judaísmo esotérico del libro de los jubileos. El libro de los jubileos es un intento de mediar entre Enoch y la Torá normativa. No es el judaísmo del Sefer Yesidá, no es el judaísmo de la Mase Merkabah o de la Mase Bereshit, es decir, toda la ingente literatura de tipo visionario y mística del judaísmo, de este judaísmo que procede del segundo templo. Por tanto, Moisés no está, pero sí está Abraham, sí está David, sí está Jesucristo, evidentemente. Bueno, ¿y quién es el último de esa? Está Zaratustra, claro está, porque Zaratustra ha cumplido ese papel de profeta entre los persas. Por tanto, veis que aquí no hay nada de, si entendemos sincretismo como algo, como un ajuste de piezas artificial, aquí no hay nada de eso. Aquí yo diría lo más normal, lo más natural, en el contexto en el que se desarrolla Mani, es que efectivamente Zaratustra se incorpore. De hecho, eso lo han hecho ya los cristianos también. ¿A qué si no el relato de Mateo 2, Mateo 2, es decir, la adoración de los Reyes Magos? Eso es una incorporación, dicha a su manera, del zoroastrismo al cristianismo. Por lo tanto, no es nada artificial ni nada sincrético esta actitud de Mani de incorporar a la figura de Zaratustra y, por lo tanto, también a el zoroastrismo. Yo creo que hay más bien una actitud, una labor orgánica, mientras que un órgano es algo vivo, una construcción de piezas, ¿no? Como la de los niños, las construcciones de piezas de arquitectura, donde nosotros vamos cogiendo taquito y vamos formando lo que queramos. No es eso, no es eso en absoluto el universalismo de Mani. El universalismo de Mani es un universalismo orgánico, como era el de uno de sus grandes maestros, ¿no? El más maestro de Mani es San Pablo. Es Pablo de Tarso. De hecho, los discípulos de Mani llamaban a Mani perdón, se me ha olvidado. ¿Cómo lo llamaban? Vamos, se suele decir en latín el intérprete de Pablo. El intérprete de Pablo. Era el término que utilizaban los discípulos de Mani para llamar a Mani. Y de hecho, la propia biografía que Mani escribe, o la autobiografía, la escribe siguiendo las pautas literarias de las cartas de San Pablo. Bien, hay aquí muchos detalles con respecto a esta actitud, con respecto al cristianismo de Mani, muy interesante. Cada vez que se descubre un manuscrito del maniqueísmo, por ejemplo, eso ya sucedió con los manuscritos de Turfán a principios del siglo XX, ha vuelto a suceder en el manuscrito de Kelly, eso no hace muchos años, pues se suscita una polémica en el mundo de los eruditos. ¿Este texto es cristiano o es maniqueo? Claro, ¿y eso por qué? Pues porque es tanta la cercanía, es tanta la cercanía entre la teología cristiana y la teología maniquea que muchas veces no se sabe muy bien a qué pertenece. Por ejemplo, los textos maniqueos suelen empezar,
Don José, ¿podría ir concluyendo porque estamos faltos de tiempo?
Vale, estupendo. Bueno, voy concluyendo. Bueno, el siguiente paso que va a hacer, ¿cuánto me das? ¿Cuánto me das, Alberto?
2 minutos.
Bueno, el siguiente paso que va a dar Mani es incorporar a Buda. El maniqueísmo, que es una religión muy proselitista, enseguida va a la India y se encuentra con el budismo. Y entonces, ¿qué es lo que hace Mani? Pues Buda es el profeta para los indios. Luego se incorpora orgánicamente el budismo a el corpus el doctrinal del maniqueísmo. Y cuando va a China, ¿qué es lo que se encuentra? Con Lao Tse y Confucio. Luego Lao Tse y Confucio son los profetas, la de la cadena profética para los chinos. Y con lo cual se incorpora también al maniqueísmo estas figuras con sus respectivas proposiciones o planteamientos religiosos. Claro, pero no de manera oportunista, sino de manera coherente. De manera coherente, porque si se mantiene la idea de la universalidad de la revelación, esa revelación acaece en todos los lugares. Luego, claro está, Mani es la culminación de todos ellos. Mani es el sello de los profetas. Y aquí abro otro debate, ¿no? En qué medida Mahoma no depende de la predicación de Mani, ¿no? Cuando Mahoma se dice el sello de los profetas, está dando un paso más allá de Mani, pero en cualquier caso vinculado también a esta tradición. En definitiva, yo utilizaría, para desterrar un término siempre un poco molesto y peyorativo e injusto, de sincretismo, yo utilizaría la categoría de hibridez, que es precisamente una que un investigador del gnosticismo, como es David Braque, emplea para referirse a otro movimiento que precisamente también se le ha acusado muchas veces de sincretismo, y es el gnosticismo. Yo creo que efectivamente en Mani lo que reluce sobre cualquier otra cosa, lo que hace que le da, digamos, le da prestigio a su universalismo es justamente la noción de hibridez, más otras categorías, como son las de polinimia, teocracia, transparencia de personaje, que tenía pensado desarrollar, pero ya veo evidentemente que no hay tiempo. Entonces, bueno, si os parece bien, simplemente voy a acabar con una reflexión de Jonas. Jonas, en su libro precisamente sobre el gnosticismo, él se hace esta pregunta. Ante la acusación al gnosticismo de sincretismo, dice Jonas, ¿qué principio ordenador hay tras lo que se suele llamar sincretismo? Claro, efectivamente, ¿qué principio lleva a conformar, a formar, a reunir esas piezas? ¿Eso se hace así porque sí? ¿O obedece, por el contrario, a una experiencia profunda, religiosa del propio sujeto? Bueno, acabo aquí, gracias, y si queréis, pues supongo que podemos ampliar esto, que dejaba muchos flecos, ¿no? Naturalmente, se podrá en alguna medida, ¿no? Solventar en el diálogo.
Muchísimas gracias, don José, y estoy seguro que podrá elaborar muchas de esos puntos, porque el chat le va a dar posibilidad de ello. Hay una pregunta, la primera de Andrés Ortigosa, que dice, pregunta, el profesor Antón Pacheco decía que hay una manera de entender que el mundo no es ajeno a la palabra de Dios, es decir, la idea del verum profeta. Pero, ¿cómo puede determinarse quiénes son los predicadores de Dios? Abraham, Jesús, etcétera. O mejor, ¿quién lo propone y por qué está justificado?
Eso, evidentemente, se propone desde el propio contexto en el cual surge esta tradición. El contexto en que surge esta tradición es el de una continuidad en la forma de abordar el mundo, en la forma de abordar la relación entre los hombres, en la forma de abordar la relación de los hombres con lo trascendente o con lo luminoso. Eso nunca ha acaecido de una manera abstracta. Eso siempre ha tenido hitos muy particulares y muy concretos. En el caso del judaísmo ha sido esa propia trayectoria que vemos a lo largo de la Torá misma. Entonces, digamos, esto es algo que se autoconstituye, esto es algo que se va autoconstituyendo a partir de experiencias concretas que no acaban en una experiencia puramente solipsista o individual, sino que se comunica. Y eso es lo que precisamente da lugar a esta línea de testigos, podemos llamarlo así, de la revelación de Dios. En este caso, de la revelación de Yahvé.
Muchísimas gracias. Pues seguimos con las preguntas.
No
En la
sé si
siguiente
contesto o no.
¿Perdón? Vale, sigo con las preguntas. Y la siguiente es del profesor Padial. Muchas gracias, profesor Antón, por su muy erudita e interesante intervención. Me pregunto si en el ecumenismo orgánico de Mani, del que ha hablado, se disuelven las identidades previas o se mantienen las diferencias. Y si fue solo un movimiento intelectual o supuso conflicto, condenas o derramamientos de sangre.
Bueno, vamos a ver. La primera es, ¿me puedes repetir un segundo? La primera es que se me ha ido un momentito.
Claro que sí. Me pregunto si en el ecumenismo orgánico de Mani, del que he hablado, se disuelven las identidades previas o se mantienen las diferencias. Esa es la primera parte de
Bien.
la pregunta.
Vale, sí, la segunda ya sé. Bueno, este es precisamente el gran debate, ¿no? Es decir, los que acusan a Mani de sincretismo, pues evidentemente el argumento es que se disuelven. Claro, una vez más creo que hay que meterse dentro del propio maniqueísmo para entenderlo. Mani no tiene conciencia de disolver nada, sino de culminar. Es como si dijéramos, el cristianismo disuelve el judaísmo. Pablo, Jesús, Pedro, Santiago, los primeros discípulos disuelven el judaísmo o más bien lo culminan. Bueno, un judío ortodoxo diría que lo disuelve. Un judío cristiano diría que lo culmina. En el caso de Mani, exactamente lo mismo. Es decir, Mani no tiene conciencia de estar disolviendo ni el judaísmo, ni el cristianismo, ni el zoroastrismo, ni del budismo, sino de culminarlo. Por eso él es el sello de los profetas, justamente. Es decir, el que termina el que concluye esa tradición unánime y universal que es la que ha ido suscitando Dios a lo largo de la historia. Con respecto a la segunda pregunta, yo creo que no ha habido religión más perseguida que el maniqueísmo. El maniqueísmo, y por supuesto nadie más odiado que la figura de Mani. Mani, en cuanto que empezó su predicación, pues digamos se ganó para su causa a los emperadores sasánidas. Uno de los libros principales de Mani es el Saburagán, que precisamente es un libro dedicado a Sapur, ¿no? Uno de los reyes de Sasania. Claro, ¿esto qué llevó consigo? Pues el odio visceral y cerval de los moabs, es decir, de los sacerdotes zoroastrianos. Démonos cuenta que precisamente en ese momento el zoroastrismo ha pasado de ser una religión universalista a una religión particularista, porque se ha hecho religión oficial del Imperio Sasánida. Entonces, Kerdib, que era el gran moab, inició una persecución inmisericordia con Mani, con la figura de Mani, que fue detenido, fue torturado y fue finalmente asesinado. Y sus discípulos, la iglesia maniquea, hay que decir, entre otras cosas, que el maniqueísmo no solamente es un universalismo de derecho, sino de hecho. Hay rastros de maniqueísmo en la antigüedad y desde Japón, desde Japón, porque hay epigrafía que así lo muestra, hasta España. Se extendió, ¿no? Universalmente. encontrando generalmente, excepto con los uigures, junto con el imperio uigur en el siglo VIII, donde el maniqueísmo, Mani ya había muerto, evidentemente, el maniqueísmo es religión oficial, en el resto de momentos y de situaciones siempre fue una religión perseguida, siempre. Si perduró, y yo creo que perduró porque terminaron ahí casi mezclándose con los nestorianos en China y con los budistas, perduró por la perfecta organización interna de la Iglesia. Era una organización de una extraordinaria perfección, muy rigurosa, muy disciplinada. Pero bueno, no, el maniqueísmo fue auténticamente machacado, ¿no?
Tenemos una última pregunta sobre si el maniqueísmo sobrevive en la tradición hinduista. Hinduismo es obviamente quizás una de las religiones más sincréticas, o usemos su término, híbridas del mundo. ¿Sobrevivió ahí?
Sí, sí, no nos consta en absoluto que el hinduismo, el brahmanismo nunca haya acogido ni para bien ni para mal el maniqueísmo. Podría pensarse que en sí en el budismo. Y yo en fin, no rechazo la posible idea, el posible hecho de que efectivamente haya habido alguna influencia del maniqueísmo en el budismo, pero no el budismo indio, el budismo chino. Daos cuenta que el budismo indio en la India desaparece en el siglo XII-XIII. Desaparece, no hay budistas en la India. Sí, sí es posible, y yo lo creo muy factible, que haya habido influencia en el budismo chino, influencia maniquea en el budismo chino.
Pues, don José, muchísimas gracias por su intervención. Ha sido muy, muy interesante. Y este término de sincretismo, ¿no? que como usted dice, se tiene tan machacado, pero en realidad cuando se ve, se debería llamar otra cosa y entender de otra manera. Los que recordamos algo de historia, la importancia del sincretismo en Sudamérica, y también, y ahí, digamos, de cierta manera fue exitoso, pero en otros lados del mundo no. Por ejemplo, la introducción de los jesuitas en la China, si recuerdo bien, llega a ser un gran conflicto entre los jesuitas de la China y el Vaticano. El Vaticano insiste. ¿Cómo?
A través de Matteo Ricci, el jesuita
Claro,
que...
claro.
Bueno, pero eso fue una política muy inteligente de los jesuitas. Eso sucede también en la India, sucede en Etiopía con un español, con el padre Páez, que era un jesuita madrileño, ¿no?
Pero
Que
el
intenta...
Vaticano, perdón, pero el Vaticano, si yo recuerdo bien, suprime a los jesuitas y les obliga a usar el término Dios en vez del término que era perfectamente usable del confucianismo. Y eso termina en la expulsión de los jesuitas en China.
Efectivamente, bueno, no solamente eso, sino ese es uno de los argumentos que luego cuando se disuelve la compañía, en el siglo ya XIX o XVIII, uno de los argumentos justamente es que ellos eran muy sincréticos, ¿no? Sí, sí, pero vamos, efectivamente, eso es un tema muy interesante, en fin, un poco desgraciado, diría yo, ¿no? Que sucediera aquello, ¿no? Porque, en fin, bueno.
Pero de esa manera vemos que en un mundo moderno la discusión del sincretismo es esencial, porque ha sido un fenómeno que desde la antigüedad hasta pues, el siglo XVII, XVI y también en la actualidad, ¿no? Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a don José por su intervención, y ahora tengo que dar paso a la siguiente ponencia.
Bien.
Bueno, pues ahora doy paso, voy a presentar a la siguiente ponencia, que es de Jonas Holst, que nos va a hablar sobre Hannah Arendt y el pluralismo y la interculturalidad. Como lo va a hacer en inglés, ahora voy a pasar a hacer la introducción en inglés. So, after Don José's wonderful talk, we will now listen to Professor Holst's paper, Plurality and Interculturality, Hannah Arendt and Raimon Panikkar on Friendship and Dialogue. Professor Holst is from the University of Zaragoza, or University of San Jorge in Zaragoza, and he is a well-renowned scholar in the subject of friendship, and has written on a number of issues about friendship, both in modern and well, especially in antiquity, and he has kickstarted the immense discussion about the topic of friendship that we've seen in the last 20 years. So we're very happy to have this capacity with us, and with no further ado, please, Jonas.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for the introduction. I hope we can also kickstart something today. Hopefully, after my presentation. Also, a warm thanks to El Equipo Directivo, who has made this possible. I know this has not been easy, I can imagine. Juanjo, Jacinto, I don't know if Jesus de Garay, if you're also there, but all of you who have made this possible now that we cannot see each other and be present in the same place. So I have chosen to focus on two modern thinkers, who I think are very relevant for one of the overall topics at this conference. I will, as you can see from the title, and I would like to just share my screen. Let me see. Hopefully you can better follow my what I'm going to say. Okay, so that you can have the quotations, and that's why I chose to have a PowerPoint ready. Good. So I will, as I go along, I will try to justify why did I choose Hannah Arendt and Raimon Panikkar for this talk. I will try to explain that and justify that as I move through their works, and it is in order to engage in a critical dialogue. Okay, it's not just, I don't just want to reproduce what they say. I think that's interesting, but let's engage in a critical dialogue where we could also question some of their theses or insights, which we may have to rethink in order to get to know more about what is it that is kind of the basis for an intercultural dialogue. So I will mainly focus on the topic of intercultural dialogue, and hopefully we can also talk about the other topic at the conference, human freedom, but that will be more in the background, okay? It will not be the main focus of my talk. So I think one of the key concepts to understand interculturality would be plurality. I think the two almost go together, and that is why I chose to take my starting point in Hannah Arendt's work. Most of you probably know her, at least her name and her work. I will not give you a full introduction, but try to move into her work through the concept of plurality. So Hannah Arendt has this idea that plurality is the basis for humanity. It is, so to speak, the human condition. And she also, in her last published work, which was actually published after her death in 1971, she claims that plurality is the law of the earth. This is a quotation from The Life of the Mind, her last published work, which was published right after her death. So this claim has been taken as somehow the condition for us humans here on earth. But I must say, I've always wondered if that is really the case. Could we speak of something as law of plurality? So what Arendt wants to say is really that it is us human beings in our plurality, in our multifarious activities and affairs, who inhabit the earth. Okay, we are the ones inhabiting the earth, not man in his individuality. Okay, that is what she wants to say, something obvious, and it is perhaps even more obvious today. Yesterday in several talks, we heard about plurality as also being, and interculturality as being something of a basis and something that we are exposed to much more today than perhaps even before, as the globalization has been inevitable and is something which could almost be considered a fact. So we are much more exposed to other cultures today than we have perhaps ever been before, at least if we look at even at the local level, where there are very few isolated cultures anymore on Earth. So that is the basic idea in Arendt, which is not something new, but perhaps what is new in her thinking is the way she defines it. Okay, so she defines it in the following way, which is actually a definition she offers in, we could consider it to be the philosophical magnum opus, the human condition, okay, where she says that plurality, human plurality, the basic condition of both action and speech, has the twofold character of equality and distinction. So Arendt's idea is that plurality is not just diversity. Okay, it's true that diversity is also an aspect of human life on Earth, but plurality, there are, so to speak, two aspects. She doesn't compare it, but I will compare it to when we talk about the third person plural, for instance, when we talk about grammatics. When we say we or they, we presuppose that there is a group of people who are somehow equal, or they form a group, and so they go together, but they are also distinct. Okay, they are not completely identical. That is what Arendt wants to say. Plurality presupposes some kind of distinction or difference, but at the same time, we go together, or they, if we talk about they or you. Okay, in plurality, there is also room for distinction. Okay, if that were not the case, as Arendt says, if we were only distinct and different, we could not understand each other. Okay, that's her basic argument. I cannot go into if it is valid, but I think she has a valid argument there. That has to be something that we humans have in common in order to communicate at a basic level. Okay. On the other hand, if we were completely equal and identical, there would be no reason to talk and to speak and to act. Okay, so there is also inevitably distinctions between us. So she tries to kind of find a balance, let's say, between the two. Okay. Now, I'll come back to the question of plurality. Is it really a law? Can we? Is Arendt right, or has she, let's say, taken the liberty to speak about plurality as a law? It is at least not a physical law. Okay, it's not a physical law, because we know there are societies. There have been societies in the 20th century. And Arendt has analyzed that, for instance, totalitarian societies. There are certain dictatorships in which the dictators or the totalitarian regime has tried to destroy plurality. That is one of Arendt's main theses in one of her works on totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, according to Arendt, is the attempt to destroy human plurality. Okay. Arendt's conclusion is that this attempt do not succeed, because it seems to be that human plurality will somehow appear even when there is an attempt to destroy it. That is kind of her hope for the future, that it seems practically impossible to destroy human plurality and human liberty. Okay, the two go together. Totalitarianism is the double attempt to eradicate human plurality and liberty. And she says this was unsuccessful, thanks to God that it didn't happen. But at least we have to see that it is not just a law. Okay, we have to say something else, because it can actually be eradicated. It could be eradicated. Okay, so it is not a physical law. Could it then be a human law? One could ask. Is it something that is plurality, something that we humans have created through our laws? That does not seem to be the case either. Okay, plurality, and also according to Arendt, plurality is not something that arose or came into being through human laws. So at the end of the day, I must say it is not quite clear that plurality should be something like a law. neither physical law or human law. So what is it? That is one of my guiding questions. You have to please do look at this presentation as a exploration, as something that we do together. I do not have all the answers. So one of the key questions is, what is entailed in plurality? I can tell you that what my thesis is, and Arendt will also lead us into that discussion and towards that thesis, is that plurality is something that has to be preserved and promoted. Plurality is not something that we can take for granted, okay? Although Arendt is almost about to take it for granted in her last work. Okay, it's like she takes the liberty there to say that it is the law of the earth, but it is nothing like a law. So let's move into a closer reading of some of the passages in The Human Condition, a major philosophical work, and see how can we make sense of plurality as something that has to be kept alive and has to be preserved and promoted by us human beings. So she has this thesis on, she has this idea that friendship plays a much bigger role than we have seen, actually, or that we have realized throughout the history of philosophy and thinking. Arendt says that we should prioritize and we should give first priority to friendship as one of the key terms which actually make possible plurality. She says that once in The Human Condition, and she will elaborate on that in another paper which she publishes, and I will come back to that. So to quote Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition, to understand what is it that she means by friendship. Now she says, respect, not unlike the Aristotelian philia politicae, is a kind of friendship without intimacy and without closeness. It is regard for the person from the distance, which the space of the world puts between us. So here, what Arendt is trying to say is that plurality is actually only preserved in certain relationships between human beings, such as friendship, because respect, what is it? It is allowing the other to be him or herself. It is precisely the allowing the other to distinguish him or herself, to be free, and at the same time, as we shall see later, friendship is also something more. But friendship is precisely the possibility of letting the other be him or herself. Okay, that's one aspect of friendship which it is vital for her to highlight, because in other relationships, in other relations between human beings, for instance, in, let's say, hate, or in hateful relationships, or in relationships where one of the parties try to destroy the other, plurality breaks down, and there's no, let's say, there's no space between the two. Okay, the two parties or more parties coming together. So friendship becomes a key term in her work, because friendship is an example of how the human condition is also preserved on Earth. Okay. So I'll give you another quotation which is more problematical, and I will have to come back to that, but it's just to give you a feeling of the scope of Hannah Arendt's thoughts about plurality dialogue and how is it that we insert ourselves into the world. So she says, with word and deed, we insert ourselves into the human world, and this insertion is like a second birth. It may be stimulated by the presence of others whose company we may wish to join, but it is never conditioned by them. So here she comes close to saying that it is actually important and vital to be in the presence of others, okay, whose company we may wish to join, but it is never conditioned by them. I will question that a little bit later on, okay? As you remember, I'll just go back one slide here so that you can see that human plurality, the basic condition of both action and speech. So according to Arendt, what makes it possible to speak and to act as human beings is actually plurality. But what I'm trying to say is, and questioning a bit, challenging Arendt, is that maybe there are words and deeds, as she tries to say here, which preserve and promote human plurality. Maybe it's actually the other way around, okay? Arendt has this tendency to take plurality for granted. And I think we have to challenge her a little bit when she does that. That's what I'm trying to say. And we need friendship as one of those relationships which do not exist. We can't take friendship for granted. It's something that is established and is furnished through certain virtues and through certain deeds and actions, obviously. Okay, so let me make it even clearer that Hannah Arendt actually she herself reflected on the vital importance of friendship in relation to the human condition. Okay, and we have to remember that the human condition and human plurality for Arendt was this combination of distinction and equality. So now she will tell us something about how friendship affects equality, and we cannot take equality for granted either. In a short text or a paper which she published in 1954, that is before The Human Condition was published and also The Life of the Mind, she claims the following. That is in a paper called Philosophy and Politics. The political non-economic equalization is friendship, philia. The political element in friendship is that in the truthful dialogue, each of the friends can understand the truth inherent in the other's opinion. This kind of understanding, seeing the world, as we rather tritely say today, from the other fellow's point of view, is the political kind of insight par excellence. Okay, so what she's trying to say here is actually that friendship is a sort of equalizing factor. Without friendship, people are less equal, she wants to say. And actually, that is one of her key points in most of her works, that equality is something that we do, something that we have to preserve and promote. And friendship is one of the key relationships, human relationships, where we become equals. Okay, so here you can see it is actually, this paper challenges a little bit the thesis which she lays out in, or puts forth in The Human Condition, where she takes the human plurality to be the, let's say, the basis for words and deeds, and for action, and for the interaction, and for the human condition. I would challenge Arendt and say maybe relationships such as friendship are actually much more vital than we think to consolidating human plurality and promoting human plurality. Now, Hannah Arendt says very little about cultural differences, and she says very little about religion. That is perhaps one of the weak points in her work. I think she almost presupposes, when she talks about human plurality, then she almost says, yes, and in human plurality is included the different cultural distinctions, differences, and religious differences too. But I think we would have to dig a little bit deeper into that and try to say that if we want to know more about what is dialogue, what is intercultural dialogue, we would have to look closer at what it means to engage in an intercultural dialogue. Hannah Arendt does not say very much about it when she says that friendship is about this truthful dialogue between friends. She doesn't really elaborate much further on that. So I would like to do that. Okay, try to see how far can we go, and see how friendship and intercultural dialogue may be intimately linked. Okay, and that is the reason why Raimon Panikkar obviously will play a big role in this last part of my presentation, because Panikkar, I think he's one of the few who has really tapped into, and I think he has a very fine and also elaborate interpretation of what it means to engage in an intercultural dialogue. And I will mainly refer to the work, his book, which came out in 2002. It actually came out first in Italian. I've read it in the Spanish translation, which I think is quite close to the, I think this is obvious. So I will quote in Spanish if that is okay, and I will explain it as I go along. Okay, but some of you or most of you may know this work. I think it's a beautiful book where he puts forth his philosophy of intercultural dialogue, paz interculturalidad. Okay, so in this book he says, and here he comes very close to Arendt in some aspects. El pluralismo surge de la conciencia simultánea de la incompatibilidad de las diferentes visiones del mundo y de la imposibilidad de juzgarlas de manera imparcial. This is very close to what Arendt says in some other parts of her work, and they seem to coincide in this aspect, that there is actually no human being above his or her culture. We are all cultural beings. Okay, so that is on the one hand what Panikkar wants to say, that if you want to know another person, get to know another person, we need to know his or her culture too. Okay. And there will be a plurality of different visions, cultural visions in the world, different perspectives. even on what is culture and what is religion. And no one is above his or her own culture. We are, so to speak, submerged in our own culture. Okay, and then his let's say the program or his main idea, his intention in the book, which I'm quoting from, is to move towards a philosophy of peace and intercultural dialogue. And I'll quote again: "Una cultura de paz es una filosofía intercultural que se basa en una aceptación de la diversidad sin que ésta sea una amenaza para la unidad del hombre." Here again, you may see that although Panikkar, he formulates it and he rephrases it in a different manner, he also tries to combine what Arendt said, distinction and equality. Okay, Panikkar's words are diversity and the unity. We need both. Okay, a diversity which will not endanger the unity of a human being. Okay, so he also sees that we need both the diversity and the unity. I think yesterday in both Alejandro's talk yesterday about the Platonic dialogues, I think Alejandro was also touching upon some of these topics, and especially Miguel Escobar, I think in his talk was also very, I think in that line that we need, the starting point for an intercultural dialogue is not relativism. Panikkar would say the same thing, but it is actually that each one of us has firm ground under our feet in culture, either confessional, as Miguel, I think your thesis was that it kind of needs to be confessional, and definitely it is part of our identity. But at the same time, if there is going to be intercultural dialogue, we shouldn't be identifying completely with our own culture. We should also, and that is Panikkar's other thesis, that in order to engage in an intercultural dialogue, we should also be able to move beyond our own culture. Okay, and that is where it becomes tricky, because if no one is above their own culture, if we are all immersed, or so to speak, submerged and part of our own culture, how can we move beyond our own culture? I think that is one of the key questions to be answered in his book. Okay, so I think the only way to move beyond our own culture, according to Panikkar, I think that is one of the way to interpret him would be to take a leap into the third dimension. Okay, the transcendence or la transcendencia. What does he mean by that? I think one of the key phrases in his work is the following: La vía pacífica pasa por el reconocimiento de que hay algo en el hombre que transciende la mera humanidad. Okay. I think this is so important that it actually needs an interpretation which Panikkar does not offer himself. I think we could actually just spend the rest of the time trying to interpret that sentence. I think it is incredibly important, because if we, or each one of us, accept that there is something in us which transcends us at the same time, then I can no longer be a fundamentalist. I can no longer be a fanatic. Okay, because there is something in me as human being, and so there is also something in other human beings which transcend their humanity. And if that is the case, then I would always move within a space where I do not know myself completely. I do not identify completely with my own culture, because I know there's something beyond my own culture which exists and which I would like to know about. And if I think the way towards peace, as Panikkar says, needs to move towards in that direction. Okay. Another quotation from the book, which I think is also paradigmatic of Panikkar's philosophy, is that la paz requiere comprensión del otro, lo cual no es posible sin trascender el propio punto de vista, sin interculturalidad. But I think we can still ask, what about all those who are not ready to move beyond their own culture? That is, I think we have to face the fact that there are many people, and we can perhaps even sometimes identify ourselves with them and see ourselves sometimes also being a tendency towards giving priority to our own culture. I think that may happen, that can happen to us. Okay, and what is Panikkar's solution? What is his answer to those who will not move into the third dimension into transcendence. And I think there are several answers in Panikkar's work, which is interesting. There's not just one answer. Okay, so I'll try to move beyond towards the answer, which is more in line with what I spoke about earlier, friendship. But I will leave the door open to other possible answers. There are definitely one more answer in Panikkar's work, and I think that would be interesting also to explore together. One last quotation from the work Paz e Interculturalidad, which I think is very important, is that el diálogo intercultural en el sentido propio del término tiene lugar con el extranjero, dos dialogantes que se escuchan recíprocamente. That means, I think that for Panikkar, the other will always be a stranger to me, but it will be a stranger with whom I may reach some kind of understanding, if insofar as I also see myself as a stranger in this world. That would be my thesis. Okay, that both of us accept there are limits to our own knowledge. Yesterday, I think most of the speakers talked about la humildad, humbleness. Okay, inherent in interculturality. If we want an intercultural dialogue, we need to be aware of our own limits, and that is that there's something that transcends us. Okay, and I think that is the aspect of religion, which Panikkar, when he says intercultural dialogue, is also always interreligious dialogue. Okay, he includes into the intercultural dialogue there will be aspects of transcendence, and that will be for Panikkar aspects of religiosity. Okay, so let me move into the last slide, and then I will finish with some open questions and we can discuss it. I would like to conclude by saying that I think that the dialogue which Arendt and Panikkar envisions, what they see, the dialogue which they would like to promote in order to also preserve plurality, is really a dialogue between friends. Understanding by friends, not just any friends, but those friends who would like to get to know each other, not just as, let's say, basic human beings, but also what goes beyond humanity. Okay, so it comes close to Platonic dialogues in my thesis. I cannot go into that, but I think at the end of the day, dialogue succeeds in Platonic dialogues, as Socrates says, only between friends. Okay, so there's one important quotation to underpin this argument, which I would like to offer here in the end. The argument that el diálogo and intercultura, diálogo intercultural, this dia and inter, which is moving through a space together, which is between us. Okay, this is the space between us. If you remember the first quotation from Hannah Arendt, it is the space between us which is important to promote plurality, human plurality, and thus also human freedom. It is this space that we need to preserve. Okay, so Panikkar says towards the end in the work which I've been quoting from, la filosofía, a pesar de su nombre, se ha concentrado más en la gnosis, intelecto, que en la filia, agape o eros. Tal vez pertenece a nuestro tiempo hacer que las dos grandes fuerzas del hombre, intelecto y amor, confluyan en una polaridad adual. Okay. Now, Hannah Arendt, she says something very similar, although quite different at the same time, but she also proposes friendship as an example of humanity. And she does that in a text where she speaks about Lessing's Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise. You may know that. That's a beautiful drama where, I should just say that as a context within our conference, the beautiful dialogue where the three cultures meet, actually, and they realize in this drama by Lessing, the three cultures, three representatives, a Jew, a Christian, and from the Muslim country, those three go together and they suddenly see a certain affinity. They suddenly see what they share. That's the end of the drama. It ends on a positive note. And there Arendt says, Lessing showed us that humanity is exemplified not by fraternity, but in friendship. A readiness to share our views with others. That friendship is not intimately personal, but makes political demands and preserves reference to the world. Okay, so it's a bit different from Panikkar, but at the same time, friendship as one example, and that just means that it is one example, not necessarily the paradigm, but one example of how we can preserve and promote intercultural dialogue in this reciprocal relationship of listening, speaking, but first of all, I think it is about listening to each other and being open, obviously, and that is the part of listening is to be open towards what the other is trying to tell us. And I will leave it there, and hopefully there will be room for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Holst. This has been a pleasure, a beautiful talk, and the evocation to Escobar's talk yesterday was very apt. We really see the links. So we have questions already, and Professor Padial, thank you very much for a really beautiful lecture. Could you develop further a little more on the starting point of intercultural dialogue according to Panikkar and his denial that it could be relativism?
Right. So Panikkar, he explicitly says that intercultural dialogue could not be reduced to relativism. On the contrary, he would say that intercultural dialogue is based on I have to say that in Spanish, relacionalidad. Okay, that is in the relation, that we are all related to each other. But reaching that insight, that is my thesis, is something that we can only do by in the meeting, in the encounter with other people. Panikkar has this very actually not pragmatical, but it is definitely a practical philosophy of saying, I cannot beforehand know who the other is. I would have to meet, and in that encounter of listening and rubbing the words against each other, as Plato would say, we would have to. It would have to be through an intercourse of interaction, of meeting, and sincerely, obviously trying to understand each other based on certain confidence, okay, and openness. It is obviously also a philosophy of vulnerability, that I open myself towards questioning my own culture and my own identity. It is suddenly you are exposed to your own limits and seeing your own limits, and that can only be done, I think Panikkar would say, in a sincere dialogue with not just your neighbor, as he says. It is always with the stranger who you cannot completely understand, and that is precisely the challenge you need to realize that you yourself are a limited being, but you contain something which each of us contain something which is beyond our own culture, and that is what we can only realize in this dialogue, with intercultural dialogue with other cultures, and obviously human beings who are firmly grounded in their own culture. So we have to presuppose up to a certain point a certain mutual openness, and when that happens, I think Panikkar will say, then the doors open, and you can suddenly realize certain things about yourself and your own culture, both what is a limit in your culture, but also what is beyond your own culture, because we share something over that transcendent horizon. That is obviously the more, let's call it, the spiritual thesis or the religious thesis of Panikkar, is that no culture has privileged access to the truth, but we all share, and we all tell the truth in different ways, in different limited ways, okay, through myths. That would be probably, we will not have time perhaps to go into the topic of myth and symbol in his work, because that is obviously very important, that he's not just talking about exchanging words. It is about moving into the space of myth and symbols, which cannot just be reduced to knowledge. Okay, when we move into the space of myth and symbols, then we realize, if we do that in a sincere way, and that is when we touch the limits of our own culture and get into touch with other cultures. Okay, at the same time, when we move up to the limits of our own culture, within myth and symbols, realizing the immense richness of myths and symbols which can never be laid out in language, then we realize that there's something beyond language and something beyond culture. And that is where we get into touch actually with what other cultures have said and spoken about myths and symbols.
Thank you. And this is a really interesting place to insert this question from Alessandro Corleonis, who just had the talk previously. And he says, many thanks to Professor Holst for this really interesting presentation. I have a question connected to the previous one. Does Panikkar's idea that intercultural dialogue is based on the acknowledgement that something in us must transcend imply a necessarily religious foundation for intercultural dialogue? Yeah.
I myself, I think there are two readings here. Instead of just saying what I think there are two readings, because Panikkar, in certain passages of Paz e Interculturalidad, certain passages he says that interculturality entails interreligiosity, so that the part of intercultural dialogue will also be, or will entail somehow, religious aspects, and will thus also be interreligious dialogue. But then I would say, what happens, and Panikkar also reflects on that topic, that if you engage in a dialogue with an atheist or somebody who is completely secular and will not accept any dogmas or even listen to or accept, let's say, a dialogue within the horizon of religion or a sacred space, then one would ask, is this still a interreligious dialogue? Okay, I would have my doubts, and I think I would be more in line with, I don't know if I can speak for Miguel, but I think Miguel, what he said yesterday is that interreligious dialogue would have to be somehow between two confessions, or at least people or parties who have their firm ground in religion, and that is also in the rites, in the rituals, in a certain confession. So I have my doubts because, as you know, Panikkar, I read him also in a different way. Okay, so I think there's this, and that is also where I myself am. I must say that I think that there is an aspect, and he also says that Panikkar, there's an aspect of human existence and of transcendence where we are moved into a sphere of which you can interpret as religion. But I would say, I would leave it open and say this could also be interpreted in other ways as something that is beyond culture. So I don't think, for me, I don't think it has to be that intercultural dialogue does not have to be interreligious dialogue. Panikkar comes close to saying that in certain passages of his work, but I think he leaves it open that could it also be, as you know, he also says in Panikkar that, for instance, in Japanese culture, speaking about religion is difficult because it is not religion in the same sense as we would understand religion, let's say in Europe or in European traditions. Right? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? That I as you see, I like the word transcendent better because it leaves the door open to saying it is a way of interpreting existence which is beyond our own control, let's say that, and also even language, our own language. But we are in touch with that dimension of our existence somehow, either consciously or unconsciously. Okay, so that would be my answer. Two possible readings of Panikkar, I think, there.
Yes, and if you leave that door open in that way, then the individual can then make their own interpretations, religious or non-religious, or they can move on. We have one last question quickly. It's been so wonderful to see all these connections between your talk and other talks. And I was thinking about Rasenberg's talk earlier this day, even though you couldn't be here, but he was talking about racialized phenomenology and the experience of minorities. And I was thinking, from your perspective, it seems rather, it's on an individual level. Friendship, I am friends, I meet another. But what happens when it becomes when we talk about the collective level. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit about the difference about the individual and the collective levels, because I'm not sure that the things that we find on the individual level here with Arendt and Panikkar apply to the collective level. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, interesting. I think there we would perhaps either have to move beyond the context of friendship, could be. I think that would be one way to conceptualize it and see that we would need to draw on concepts of collective identities or solidarity. That would be a concept which would extend what I'm trying to say at the level of friendship, which is more interpersonal relationships. We would have to extend that into the sphere. This is obviously always the controversy and discussion. How do we go from ethics into politics? How do we go from, let's say, interpersonal relationships and a dialogue and at an interpersonal level into the whole of society, or where we have collective identities such as Black Lives Matter? This cannot, I think that is true. We cannot only understand that within a narrow context of friendship. That is true. I think we would have to conceptualize that in other terms. And still, I would say that an ethics of friendship, or the ethical aspect which I would like to highlight in friendship, is precisely that friendship, the good form, the ethical form of friendship, is based on a relationship to somebody else who I do not know completely, and realizing that kind of gives me feedback that, oh, as he or she is a human being and I am too, I suddenly realize that I don't know myself either completely. So I normally say that what friendship contributes to somehow also in the larger context of a society is that you become very aware, and I usually say it is the joyous defeat of the I, the joyous defeat. Okay, la derrota jubilosa del yo. So we have to realize that we are limited beings, and that also means that our identity should not be rooted only in one thing. That is obviously one. If we do that, we either become fanatics or we move completely out of plurality, and we want to preserve plurality and diversity. And the only way we can do that, I think, is to also promote relationships at the interpersonal level, keep promoting those relationships, and also to get examples of what it is concretely to realize my own limits. Okay, realizing my own limits, and from then on, no longer judge and have prejudice towards others. I think that there has to be somehow at a phenomenological level an experience of my own limits, okay, in an encounter face to face with another human being. And then I think the doors are open. Once I realize that I myself am a stranger, okay, which is an experience which I have received through the encounters with other people who I love and who I care for, then I think the doors are open for accepting any diversity or difference. So that's why I put so much emphasis on friendship, because I think it is the basis for moving into collective identities, where there is another danger. I'm sorry I couldn't be present this morning as I was in class, but I think the danger there, and maybe the speaker did talk about that in his talk, the identity, the danger is that I identify myself too much with my own culture or my own race, to say, put between brackets, obviously. Right? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? That at the individual and collective level, there's always the danger of identifying myself too much with my own culture. That is why Panikkar still is so relevant, because he is so aware of this double, I would say, double nature of us human beings, that we are obviously part of our culture. We cannot move just beyond our culture, and still we do contain something that is part of humanity, which transcends our mere, as he says, mera humanidad. Okay, this could obviously be interpreted in different ways, but I'll leave it there. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Holst. We can perhaps say that the door of friendship is the antidote to dehumanization, and we really thank you for this talk that has really allowed us to discuss so many subjects that have been, bouncing about in our Congress or seminar these days. Now we have reached the middle of the seminar, actually, and the next, we'll have a lunch break now, and I'll say this in Spanish and thank you. Bueno, ahora tenemos una pausa para comer y después tenemos el privilegio de escuchar a Jacinto Choza, que va a abrir la siguiente sección sobre política y la libertad humana. Bueno, Choza no necesita presentación, pero ya se le presentará el gran padrino, ¿no?, de nuestro seminario. Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias y a las 4:30, después de la pausa, nos vemos otra vez. Y otra vez muchísimas gracias a